Есть у них, да? Перевод класса. Я на колонку поставлю.
Colleagues, one of the guests of the conference has mislaid a black mobile telephone. If anyone has found it, if you could bring it up to the sound team at the front here. It's an HTC black mobile telephone. Thank you.
Құрметті конференция қатысушылары, сіздерді білім беру, зерттеу және тұрақты даму тақырыбындағы 7-ші халықаралық ғылыми тәжірибелік конференциясының күндізгі сессиясында қайта көргенімізге қуаныштымыз. Күндізгі сессияның алғашқы баяндама тақырыбы оқытудың демократизациясы және сыныптағы оқыту, мұғалімдердің тәжірибесін зерттеу мақсаты. Баяндамашы Шығыс Англия университетінің құрметті профессоры Джон Эллиот. Мұғалімдердің қалыптасқан оқыту мен үрдістерін трансформациялау үшін мұғалімнің басқалармен бірге жұмыс жасаумен қатар өздік рефлексия мен зерттеумен жүйелі түрде айналысудың маңыздылығын айтып өтеді.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and very grateful for the invitation. My talk is a response to inquiries about what is my view about action research, which I've been involved in for the last, I should think, 40 years. Now, there are many different versions of action research, and I'm going to argue that the action research that I have been associated with is of an ethically informed inquiry. So I will press a button and see if I can get to my first slide. Right. Oh, it doesn't quite come up properly here. Oh. Can somebody help me, because everything is not coming up on the screen for me. Maybe I must go and get some paper copies of my... Is it? But no. I'd better go and get... No? Oh, I can turn around and look. Okay, thank you. Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Now, I am going to be talking about educational action research, not action research generally. And the focus for the action research I'm going to talk about is teaching in schools and in classrooms and in universities. And I'm going to argue that the whole teachers as researchers movement in the UK that stems from the work of Lawrence Stenhouse, the whole emphasis was on making teaching more educational. And it was connected with helping teachers to realize certain aims and values in their practice. So it was based on the assumption, well, it was based on the argument that teaching is a social practice. It's not simply a technology for engineering certain predefined learning outcomes that have high economic commodity value in society. Based on the view that teaching is a social practice and it's embedded in certain values and beliefs, embedded, if you like, in a professional culture. So intrinsic to teaching as a social practice are certain social ends that define an ideal form of life in society. Now, these social ends, they refer to values it is the teacher's task to realize through his or her interactions with learners in the classroom. And these ends, they set criteria for what is to count as an educationally worthwhile process of teaching and learning. So in other words, a task of action research is to realize the ends that define a worthwhile process, I emphasize process, of teaching and learning. I'm referring to the process, not to the consequences or the outcomes of the process. Because in education today, we are dominated by what is called outcomes-based education. And outcomes education ignores the view, neglects the view that teaching is a social practice, which is defined by certain values and beliefs about what is to count as a worthwhile educational process. Now, Stenhouse had a process model of curriculum planning and development. Now, I don't know very much about the curriculum framework in Kazakhstan, but Stenhouse's view was the important thing about the process model was it was the quality of the educational process that the child was engaged in the learning environment, in the school, in the classroom, that was very, very important. And he became an articulate critic of the outcome-based behavioural objectives model of curriculum planning. That was called, and still is called, rational curriculum planning. So the curriculum was planned to achieve certain pre-specifiable learning outcomes. Now again, Stenhouse argued for a process model that defined what was a worthwhile educational process. So yes, it was important to specify the curriculum content, but the important thing was, how does a teacher interact with the student in relationship to that content? It was that process by which the teacher interacted with the students, interacting with the content, that was the very important, significant thing. So that the goals of teaching cannot be reduced to psychological and behavioural changes in individuals that are disconnected from the form of social life in which they are to be nurtured. And we will have heard this morning quite a lot about John Dewey. Well, that was precisely the argument of John Dewey. Now, just to look at the process model again, many innovatory pedagogical aims, and I heard some in the meeting I attended yesterday. For example, I believe that the curriculum language in Kazakhstan, in that part of that language, is the idea of learner-centered education, right? Now, I would call that innovatory pedagogical aim. Other examples I put up there: developing understanding, inquiry, discovery learning, independent, self-directed, autonomous learning, problem-based learning, learning through discussion. These are all aims that are raised in the context of curriculum reforms. And they are indicative of a movement in the wider social milieu towards a greater liberal democracy in our society. So in other words, I would argue that these aims actually refer to clusters of values that are about the democratization of the educational process. Now, Stenhouse was very quick to grasp that these aims implied a process model of curriculum design as expressions of the social ends of education. These aims were to be analysed into principles of procedure governing the process of education rather than into pre-specified learning outcomes. So in other words, certain kinds of aims, like the ones that I have referred to, that are listed there, these aims, if you analyse them into principles governing the interaction between teachers and pupils in classrooms. You don't analyse them into more specific objectives. So in other words, very often when we talk about aims in education, we are not talking about outcomes. We are talking about the quality of the educational process. We are talking about the quality of the interactions between the pupils and between the teacher and the pupils in the classroom. Okay. Now, Dewey argued in 1897, we heard this morning that he died in, what was it, 1952? In 1897, he produced something called My Pedagogic Creed. And he argued that with the advent of democracy, it is impossible to prepare the child for any set of conditions. In other words, we have to enable children to create, through the educational system, their own futures. We cannot spend enormous amounts of resources in a futile task, which is to create children's futures for them, when our societies are being globalized, changing, and so on and so forth. So this requires great pedagogical adjustment, and it calls for the constant regard to the cultivation of the individual's own powers, tastes, and interests. So aims and procedural principles orientate teaching to the cultivation of these powers that you need children to acquire in a democratic society. And Stenhouse believed that the acquisition of these powers was incompatible with a technological approach to teaching that was entirely focused on the production of measurable learning outcomes. So, I'm hoping to give people some food for thought, because the realization of the procedural values implicit in the social ends of education require a great deal of innovation by teachers as they attempt to transform prevailing cultures of teaching and learning in the light of them. We have made a terrible mistake by assuming that teachers could simply take these aims of education that I have referred to and implement them. No problem whatsoever. Just let the teachers get on with it in the classroom. Well, I've had numerous teachers, for example, say to me, John, come into my classroom because I'm having a discussion with the children. And I want you to observe this discussion. And I will sit there and I think, where is the discussion? What I observe is question, answer, question, answer, question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. Is that a discussion? No, it's not a discussion. So, learner-centered education. I worked on educational reforms in post-independence Namibia, some years being more learner-centered. And of course they didn't. Because what needs to be unpacked is what are the values and the principles that are embedded in these educational goals. And then the task of the teacher is to try to find ways of realizing these values and the principles in forms of transformative action in their classroom. Now, even if I haven't got time to say anything else this afternoon, the action research tradition that started in Britain, I'm not saying action research started in Britain, it didn't. There is a German form of action research There is an American form of action research. And interestingly, both those forms of action research were attempts to transform the academic discipline of the social sciences. So they were an attempt to reconstruct a university discipline to make it more relevant to practice. But the action research that started in Britain with the work of Stenhouse was focused not on transforming the social sciences and making it more relevant to practice. It was focused on realizing certain educational values that reflected significant movements in the social milieu, in realizing them in practice, in the classroom situation. And that needed a great deal of systematic reflection, thought, evidence gathering on the part of teachers. So that was what action research was. It was, if you like, an ethically informed methodology of inquiry, and it was very consistent with the pragmatist philosophical tradition that we heard about this morning of John Dewey. So, now in the United States of America, Stenhouse pointed out there was an interesting example of the process model of curriculum design, and that was Jerome Bruner's elementary school social science curriculum called Manor Course of Study. Now, I don't have time to spell out all the principles or pedagogical aims, as they were called, that structured the design of Manor Course of Study, the elementary social science curriculum that John Dewey created. Sorry, not John Dewey, Jerome Bruner. But you can see there, I've just put up a few of the principles of procedure that govern the design of that curriculum. Now, Stenhouse argued the problem there was teachers were not supported to undertake action research into the realization of those principles, those pedagogical aims in action. And because the teachers were not enabled to undertake action research into how they realize these principles in action, eventually Manor Course of Study basically faded away in the American elementary school. Now, I'm just going to very briefly mention two examples of a process model of curriculum design that formed the basis for two big action research projects. One was the Humanities Project, and it was a very good example of taking an aim and which was the development of understanding of human situations and actions and the controversial issues they raised in society. And what Stenhouse then did was he analysed that aim into a number of procedural principles. For example, teachers should not use their authority as teachers as a platform for promoting their own views in the classroom. That the mode of inquiry in controversial issues should have discussion rather than instruction at its core. That the discussion should protect divergence of view amongst the participants. And that the teacher should have responsibility for quality and standards in learning. Now then, Stenhouse argued, those principles can only be realized if the teacher takes on the role of a researcher in the classroom. And one of my jobs, when I was appointed onto this project, was helping the teachers to carry out research in their classroom. And these were teachers all over England, in what we call the experimental school. And we've got teachers not only doing research in their individual classrooms, but coming together at conferences and seminars, comparing their data with one another and coming up with certain hypotheses about how do you realize these values in action in the particular settings in which we teach. So, a knowledge base was built about how you realize these principles for the teaching of controversial issues in classrooms and schools. And the teachers collaboratively constructed this knowledge base that then has been systematically ignored for many years. So teachers still go on about how do we teach controversial issues? Well, once upon a time, teachers got together, gathered data, compared and contrasted each other's experience, and generated some fairly general insights into strategies for realizing these procedural principles in order to foster and develop the children's understanding in the classroom. And yet, people go on, still today, reinventing the wheel, not using the findings of that project as a platform on which to build and keep developing their knowledge and understanding of the teaching of controversial situations and actions in our society.
Dear Professor John
Yeah,
Elliott.
I've got 5 minutes.
Yeah, John
Thank you.
Elliott.
I have learned from experience. Now, I'll just give you 1 or 2 examples of these hypotheses. The Stenhouse thought that teachers would take hypotheses too much as a prescription of what to do. So he produced a handbook, and we got teachers to gather data, whether it was video data, whether it was audio data, whether it was interviews with the students, to gather the data and to ask themselves some questions. To what extent do you interrupt students when they are speaking? Why? And to what effect? Reflective discussion can often be slow-paced and contain sustained silences. What proportion of these silences are interrupted by you? The students can use silence as a weapon to make the teacher take over the task they should face as a group. Do you pressurize towards consensus? For example, do you say a lot in your classroom? Do we all agree with what Sydney has just said? What effect does that have? Because what we found was that when the teacher said that, there was total silence in the class. And eventually, the child said, yes, we agree, and that was the end. That was the end of it. Well, why don't you change your behavior and say, does anyone disagree with that? Does that have a different effect? So, through the action research, teachers, if you like, were engaged in a process of trying to actually transform the classroom situation into one that was consistent with the values and the principles embodied in the aim. That was what action research used to be about, and still is about in many countries, even though it may be difficult to find sometimes in the UK. And just to finish, I'm going to give you just one more example of a project that was across the curriculum, looking at some of these general aims, and this was a project about implementing the aim of inquiry teaching in the classroom. And what we did is this is just some examples, 2 examples of this project, which involved something like 25 schools with groups of teachers in each school. So this kind of action research I'm talking about was not small scale. It came up with general insights, general hypotheses for other teachers then to use as a platform to carry on testing and carry on developing the knowledge base. But I'll just give you an example. We had a procedural principle in this project that was called students should have the freedom to express ideas and develop lines of inquiry in the classroom. And that implied the procedural principles refrain from preventing students expressing their own ideas and developing lines of inquiry, and help students to develop their own ideas and lines of inquiry. Right, how do you realize those principles in the classroom? Well, the teachers came up with this. Sorry, I will finish in a moment. There we are. When the teachers, this is something that the teachers came up with. When the teachers' questions focused the students' attention solely on the subject matter, rather than on their own ideas about it, he or she may prevent them from initiating or developing their own ideas. Such focusing will be interpreted by the students as an attempt to find out whether they know what he or she, the teacher, knows. Now, that came out of teachers interacting with students, talking with them, and the students would say, well, the trouble is, when you ask us this kind of question, we think you're just trying to find out whether we know what you know, and you're not really interested in our thinking. And so this meant that the teachers started suggesting refrain from framing your questions in terms which draw attention exclusively to the subject matter rather than to the students' thoughts about the subject matter. Now, these may seem to be very trivial little details, but what I'm saying is they came out, the findings of teachers' collaborative action research together, and through these details, teachers constructed a knowledge base, a platform of professional knowledge which other teachers could then take forward, test out further, and keep on developing. That was the idea of action research. So, just to finish, action research became the British version, what is called the pragmatic British model, which of course probably cannot be found too much in Britain today. But you can find it going in other parts of the world as educational ideas globalize. But it was really about how do teachers, if you like, transform the process of teaching and learning in the classroom in ways that is consistent with certain educational values. And if you look at those educational values, they reflect a social movement in the wider social milieu towards greater liberal democratic form of life. Right, thank you very much.
Болашақтың мектебі және білім беру оқу бағдарламасы көшбасшылық және әлеуметтік әділдік атты кітаптың негізінде әзірленген жұмысында баяндау үшін сөз Лондон университетінің колледжінің білім беру институтының профессоры Дэвид Лэмбертке беріледі. Баяндама тақырыбы пәндік терең білімдер, мұғалімдер білім беру бағдарламасын әзірлеушілер.
Hello everyone. I am absolutely delighted to be here. This is a very exciting conference. And I'm thrilled to have just listened to John because it's reminded me how much I've owed my work to his work over many years. And that gives me a good way of introducing my talk. I need to say something about myself. I am a school teacher by origin and was a geography teacher. I've always considered myself a subject specialist teacher. And so I want to open up a conversation with some of John's remarks, because although I agree with it about 90%, I do have a problem as a subject specialist teacher about a curriculum that might become too learner-centered. I've learned over the years in my career that balance is everything. I also want to say that I've been involved in the secondary education textbook project here in Astana, and my talk this afternoon arises out of that work to some extent. Because one of the things we are grappling with as we design and create new textbooks with Kazakhstani teachers is the balance of subject content and pedagogic design. And it takes a lot of hard work. So, I'm a bit too quick. So my aim, what I would like to do is to make an argument for a progressive, knowledge-led curriculum. And in so doing, I want to distinguish the features of what I'm going to be calling a 3 alternative futures heuristic. Say something more about that later. And I'll be focusing on the special significance of my remarks on teacher development, something I call curriculum leadership. But as a school teacher, I always wanted to start with the question, who are the children we teach? Who are these people in front of me? What knowledge do they come into the classroom with? Who are they? How am I going to get to know them? And I think there I and John agree totally. We have to know our children. But what I want to know also, as a subject specialist teacher, is what role does education play in preparing the children I teach for this day and age, for the 21st century. And as a subject specialist teacher, I want to know what I teach. So what do you teach? that helps make a distinctive contribution to the educated person and enable these young people to face the future as confident and capable human beings. I would say those questions have been the guiding questions for my entire career as a school teacher and as a teacher, educator, and researcher subsequently. It would help if I could change my slide. Yes. So to begin, I want to just acknowledge some contemporary challenges we face today. Face today in a way that 40 years ago, when I started my career as a teacher, maybe didn't exist so much. And I have three headings. First, we do live in this digital age. Information is everywhere. It's available all the time. And with computing technologies, it is extraordinary what we can do with that information very quickly. As a school teacher, I need to acknowledge that. But also, I'm aware that there are some global issues around today that are very, very extreme, and I think research shows they impinge on young people's minds. For example, asymmetric warfare and terror across the world. Climate change, obviously. And I think unregulated capitalism across the world, creating enormous inequalities in wealth and opportunity amongst people. And finally, culture shifts. The 3-minute culture that we are said to live in. That is a reference to the concentration span of the average person these days. I read recently an article that 3 minutes is now more like 90 seconds. But also the culture of celebrities and selfies, where everyone can be famous for at least 15 minutes with the help of Facebook and other things. And social media tyranny, where young people are in fact by social media under enormous pressure to perform and to present themselves in certain ways. Now, as a school teacher, I have to be aware of those contemporary challenges, and so do education systems. And there are lots of solutions around. Global competitiveness has put us all in what my Prime Minister calls a global race, where we tighten up the measurements so that we can be sure that we're competing successfully. And every education system I know, including Kazakhstan, is in the middle of reform. And innovation is the big word. We have to constantly innovate. But I think there are other solutions to these contemporary challenges, and I put those under the heading that I've stolen from Gerd Biester, who coined the term learnification, where a lot of curricula are becoming more and more skills-based and organized around outcomes and outputs and transversal competencies, where we're told that our job as teachers is to build the learning power of students, helping them learn to learn. We should focus on their creativity, and we should, wherever we can, personalize the curriculum to suit individuals with their different requirements and different talents. I want to be skeptical about this. Many people will have seen Ken Robinson's TED Talks available on the internet. When I last looked it up, 35 million people have seen his lecture on creativity. And I agree with Ken Robinson that the students we meet demand respect That's how I started my talk. This is Ken Robinson speaking. Students are born with extraordinary powers of imagination, intelligence, feeling, intuition, spirituality, and of physical and sensory awareness. But I disagree with some of his conclusions. There's a quotation on the right there where he says, "We are educating people out of their creative capacities." I believe this passionately, that we don't grow into creativity, we grow out of it. Or rather, we get educated out of it. I disagree with that conclusion profoundly. As a school teacher, I find it a little insulting that my work is so damaging. So I want to be skeptical about learning to learn, where learning is regarded as just a good thing in itself. If we've got students learning, that's great. Well, hang on, because learning can be trivial, it can be dangerous, it could be wrong. So learning itself is not an outcome. I think learnification and too much emphasis on learning also can cause us to treat it as a scientific, technical process. As if we just adopted the right technique, we could speed it up, we could accelerate it, as if learning quickly was a desirable thing to do. Well, it may not be, because some things that are important to learn are difficult and take time. They can be counterintuitive. They require sustained, painstaking effort. And also, too much emphasis on learning as an outcome can undermine teachers. Teachers become subservient to the learning. They don't lead the learning. So teachers describe themselves as facilitators of learning, not as teachers. I think each of those is a dangerous thing. And my feeling is that all young people have the pedagogic right to acquire knowledge, valuable knowledge, and the means, the ability to think theoretically and in the abstract, to sometimes to be able to discern better knowledge and better arguments, and to be able to make good generalizations. And it's that belief that I've held for a long, long time, which has led me to this notion of powerful knowledge, which is a term coined by Michael Young at my university in London. And I haven't got time to describe how he's come to that term, but it's an interesting story. But powerful knowledge refers to the knowledge that children and young people, and also you and me, are unlikely to acquire at home or in the workplace or in the shopping centre or from the TV or by accident. In other words, powerful knowledge probably needs to be taught. Powerful knowledge is knowledge that pupils will need if they are to become active citizens and workers in a complex modern world. That is, remember, their pedagogic right to be able to think in these powerful ways. I came across a very good example of how powerful knowledge works from a novel by the novelist Sebastian Faulks in 2012, where he described a woman who he described in the novel as the most ignorant woman in the district of France where she lived. And this was 200 years ago. But it's the way he described this woman that I found interesting. She understood so little of the material world, how water boiled, why a walnut fell from the tree, that she had to take almost everything on trust. She was an orphan, she was poor, she could not read nor write, and so she was able just to greet each day as a new experience and had no capacity to think beyond that experience. And that is a good way to illustrate how powerful knowledge works and why it's important. From Michael Young's writing, I've tried to define powerful knowledge in a series of points. It is often evidence-based. It is almost always abstract or theoretical. In other words, it's conceptual, it's about ideas, it's not facts. It's almost always part of a wider system of thought. That is very important. It's not discrete individual facts. It's something that connects together. It's dynamic, it's evolving, and it's changing, but quite reliable. The point about being changing is very important, because although it's reliable, powerful knowledge is always open to challenge and therefore discussion. Powerful knowledge is often counterintuitive. In other words, it's not common sense. We often have to be taught it. And it exists, whether we know it or not. It exists outside of our direct experience. And what Michael Young will say, and probably would have put on the top of the list, powerful knowledge is usually specialized. In fact, he would say it is almost always specialized in subjects which are not arbitrary or accidental or transient. They're there for a long time, like science, history, and geography, and so on. And I find this an intriguing idea. And it's led me to the fundamental question which really has driven my interest in education for 40 years. What is the school curriculum for? And my answer is that it is the pedagogic right of all young people that they have access to this specialized knowledge, this powerful knowledge. It is their right to be taught how to encounter the earth as an object of disciplined thought. Remember Jean, she had no equipment, mental equipment to do that. This right gives people the possibility to engage with the world beyond their experience, the concepts, the theories, and the ideas that make the subject's systematicity the thing that knits it together as a subject. And this ability to think through that disciplined thought and maybe, as I said earlier, discern better arguments. To think geographically, what does that mean? To think historically, to think scientifically, artistically, musically. So this brings us to the notion of curriculum futures, because I have found over quite a few years now that if I argue for a subject-based curriculum which values disciplined knowledge, I get accused of being old-fashioned, anti-progressive, and not in touch with the modern world. And I think that is wrong, because I am against what Michael Young and colleagues call a Future One, F1 curriculum, which is the curriculum I think many of us are familiar with, because it's the curriculum that we may have encountered in school ourselves. It's where a given body of knowledge is decided by somebody and delivered to us as if it was uncontrovertible and finished and stable. That is grossly under-socialized knowledge. And it's not the kind of curriculum that I'm arguing for. It is a heavily fact-based curriculum which puts a heavy emphasis on memory. That's not what I'm arguing for. Because that curriculum is so unpopular and absolutely redundant in this day and age, the future alternative is often the F2 curriculum, which, as I said earlier in my talk, is based around skills and competencies where subject divisions are considered to be totally artificial and transient and up for discussion. The emphasis is on experiential learning, and this is considered by Michael Young and colleagues as being grossly over-socialized. It's as if the only knowledge possible was the knowledge created in the classroom on Wednesday morning or whenever. So a future 3 curriculum is where subjects are considered not as given, as in F1, but not arbitrary either, as in F2. An F3 curriculum is driven by knowledge, it's led by knowledge, but it's led by knowledge in terms of the epistemic rules to provide ways to understand the world and to take young people beyond their everyday experience. An F3 curriculum must be discursive. It must have an element of negotiation. It must respect the knowledge in the child's head already. But the teacher must be prepared to teach a set of ideas and principles and introduce children to the arguments and the disputes of that subject community, whether it be science or history or geography. So what does a future 3 curriculum look like? Well, in terms of the secondary education textbook project that I've been working on in Astana, I hope a lot of our textbooks, our new textbooks, will display some principles of a future 3 curriculum. It is definitely knowledge-led. It is based upon this idea of powerful disciplinary knowledge, which enables what Chris Winch, the philosopher, called epistemic assent, or what Michael Young would call better thinking. It is progressive because it's motivated by social justice. It is the pedagogic right of all children to gain some access to specialized thinking. All children, not just the academic few. An F3 curriculum distinguishes curriculum as an idea from pedagogy. In other words, the curriculum question, which for me is the what shall I teach question, is in the ascendancy. And what follows that are the pedagogic selections that must be fit for purpose. If this is what I want to teach, how am I best going to do it? But there are some considerable challenges if we want to create a future 3 curriculum. One good question is, who owns powerful knowledge? If we agree about powerful knowledge, who owns it? Where is it? Where do we get it? A second question is, can the state, or maybe a textbook, codify powerful knowledge into a set of principles, like a curriculum document or something? Well, you may tell by the tone of my voice that I think the answer to that question is no. it is not possible just to list the powerful knowledge in history or geography or science. Powerful knowledge is something bigger than a set of contents or a set of facts. So who owns it? Well, it's owned by the disciplines. And therefore, I think school teachers, whether they're teachers of science or art or history, need to have a relationship with that specialized subject discipline. And so my final bullet point, what are the roles and responsibilities of teachers in bringing a Future 3 curriculum into fruition, is a very tricky question indeed, because the role and the responsibility is very large. And we've heard a lot in this conference already about how school teachers need time to think, they need time to research, they need time to build that relationship with the subject contents that they're teaching. And that's where I'm finishing.
Келесі баяндамашы нидерландық зерттеуші, Curriculum дайындау институтының бас директоры Ян ван ден Аккер curriculum реформасын тиімді қалай өткізуге болады деген сұраққа жауап беруге тырысады.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a pleasure really to be here at this very inspiring conference so far. It's most excited. It's my very first visit to Kazakhstan, which applies probably to many of the international visitors, although some of them are really veterans already, I've heard. This morning I experienced another spark of excitement of being in Kazakhstan, because I have discovered this morning that Kazakhstan has played a major role in modern curriculum era. I'll explain you later, in a minute. First, about the title of my, as you saw, how can we make curriculum change to success? That's not such an easy message. It's quite a promise, actually. It doesn't speak for itself. I can disclose to you that originally my title was How to Avoid the Usual Failure of Curriculum Reform. But in conversation with the organizers of the conference, they thought it was a bit too cynical and too pessimistic. So they asked me to come up with a bit more positive response, positive image. Yet, I like to underline, it's not so easy to make curriculum change success. We have known worldwide massive number of curriculum failures that have failed throughout the decades. That brings me actually to Kazakhstan, because some people see that, let's say, the era of modern curriculum development after World War II started in 1957, to be exact, on October the 4th, 1957, when the former Soviet Union launched their first missile, the Sputnik. And many of us are probably aware of the Sputnik shock that happened then, and the effect it had on many countries worldwide in the race for economical and technological, sometimes also even military advancement. So it had big implications on the rest of the world in terms of curriculum development. And this morning I was, like a young kid, I was Googling. I suddenly wondered where in the Soviet Union would that Sputnik have been launched. And I was Googling, and yes, indeed, ladies and gentlemen, it was launched in Kazakhstan. And to be exact, I found out it was, look at my scribbles now, in Baikonur, which seems to be in the southern part of Kazakhstan. So you might say Kazakhstan has offered the ignition point of modern curriculum development. So how wonderful to be here, the first time in my life. If you try to give a short summary of what happened to the say hundreds of curriculum development projects worldwide after the Sputnik shock. There were a lot of them in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s worldwide. If you try in a bit of a gross way to summarize the impact of those projects, and oftentimes they were subject-based in physics and chemistry and mathematics or whatever, and your idea was in your country that you would reach all the teachers, let's say 100% of them. If you try to evaluate a couple of years later the impact, you usually notice that about 70% of the people said, yes, it sounds familiar, I've heard of that project. That usually had a nice acronym, and let's call it ABC, the American Biology Curriculum or so. Yes, I've heard of that. That seems to have been an interesting project. 50% said, yes, I've actually seen some of that stuff. I was recently at the Regional Teachers Association meeting for biology teachers. I saw some interesting stuff there. Yes, I've seen it. Looked quite interesting, actually. 60% of that 50%, so we're already at 30%, would say, yes, we actually have it as a school. We thought, well, this looks that much promising, let's buy it. Half of them said, well, actually, we're actually using it. We've replaced the old textbook, we're using these new materials. So we're already at 15%. If you go then beyond the classroom door, the famous book title of John Goodland, and you do some strange arithmetics, you could say that about 1/3 of the original intentions behind that new curriculum were adequately realized in the classroom. So 5% according to the intentions of the teaching and learning that was occurring there. And if you ask the questions, what have the students now actually learned better, more profound, or more engaging, or more effective, or more efficient, you usually answer in all those impact studies was, basically, we don't know. So that was a sort of the overall effect of many previous curriculum projects, and that should make us a bit sober and humble in our expectations of what you can reach in curriculum innovation if you're interested to accomplish that at a large scale. Apparently, it's very difficult. That is not always realized by politicians. In many countries, politicians tend to think, once they've made a political decision, yes, we are going to introduce a new curriculum, and they like to say, well, ladies and gentlemen, to whoever is their servant, all you do is to implement it. Can there be more wrong? It's very difficult to have a satisfying implementation, realization of ideas on a wide scale. And there are no quick fixes. There are no silver bullets. It's always a long-term process. It's not just a short event. Many levels and components are involved. I'll tell you a little bit more about it. There's many participants, and you might summarize it by it's always a process of blood, sweat, and tears. A familiar message it has become nowadays. Change in education is easy to propose, hard to implement, and extraordinarily difficult to sustain. I'm sure many of you will recognize this. Brings me to a new example for the Netherlands, because we have also a new ambitious Secretary of Education nowadays. Yes, of course, like many countries worldwide, also the Netherlands, we are going to change our education. The major drivers of that look quite a lot like David had just assembled very elegantly, I think, how he summarized that. The basic question that we're asking ourselves, at this very moment we have a national debate, I'm quite happy actually to experience that we find as a country, nationwide, there's many stakeholders, we actually have a recruitment debate. It's like a dream coming true. And it's all around the classic curriculum question. What knowledge is of most worth? Because there's always so much knowledge that is interesting and relevant, what of most worth, and not only for nowadays learning, but also to prepare the youngsters for the future. Sounds like an empty remark, but nevertheless, if you take it seriously, it's quite demanding. This challenge is also common in many other countries, of course. The most recent one I saw is a booklet that I mentioned here from UNESCO, just published last month, about rethinking education as a sort of inspiring document for many nations around the world. Because everywhere on this globe, we are trying to rethink, to take a few steps back, because all the major changes that are evolving in the globe, what is actually of most worth. And we all like to talk about quality. Who is against quality? Nobody, of course. In UNESCO, for example, we try to make worldwide quality. The emphasis gradually shifting to access, giving all students access to education, and more they also like to talk about quality. But we all realize quality is a very physical concept, of course. And I do think that curriculum thinking helps there in clarifying and addressing quality issues. But it's not so easy, because we have to realize that curriculum is a multi-dimensional concept, as I like to see it. There are many levels of curriculum and curriculum development, many representations, many components, and many actors. I will walk across quickly a few of them. Later on this afternoon, I have another sort of work group session. I can elaborate a bit more on some of those parts. So I go relatively quickly. First of all, this is my favorite picture of the curriculum. I'm sure you all recognize the curriculum here, don't you? You can actually see it here. And for the sharp observer, there are actually two sorts of criteria here. I often use this picture, and I hope some of you recognize here, of course, Charles Heston in his role of Ben-Hur in ancient Rome. A problem always with curriculum definitions is that every author has the tendency to come up with a new definition, and sometimes it takes a whole page for them. And those circumstances, I always like to go back to the linguistic etymological roots of a concept, and we go back to the Latin word currere, which means actually running, which is a sound connotation actually, means running. And curriculum is the track that these horses are running around. This oval track, you know, I'm sure you recognize that. So if you apply that to education context of running, so it's learning, this track, this course for learning, or this plan for learning. So there's a universal element in the definition of curriculum, which means plan for learning. In many languages it comes across there. There's a small, if you look in the Oxford Dictionary, you will see there's also a second connotation of the word curriculum, and it's actually this chariot, this little car that this Ben-Hur is driving on. And sometimes, if you make more cynical jokes in educational discourse, we say that must be the textbook that the teacher is driving on. If Ben here is the teacher driving the students, and you see all the shouting parents and politicians, of course, go faster, go faster. What also helps to, let's say, avoid some confusion in the curriculum discourse is to distinguish various layers, various levels of curriculum development. Most familiar are probably the middle three, the macro level at the system. What as a nation you want to define of what knowledge is of most worth to your students. The micro level, what's actually happening in the classroom between the teachers and the learners and the materials that they use. Somewhere in between is the meso level, between, let's say, the national and the classroom level, the school. I know that in some countries we don't expect much of schools, in other countries we expect a lot of schools in the curriculum domain. In my own country, where schools have quite some autonomy, we expect a lot of schools to make their own curriculum choices. But in some countries that is seen as even undesirable. And there, the trick is, of course, if you're interested in large-scale curriculum change, to bridge that gap one way or another, to give more harmony about broad ideas, what's happening locally. That's also increasingly influenced nowadays what you might call the super-curriculum, what is happening across countries at the international level. There is not a real worldwide curriculum, of course, thank God perhaps. But there are a lot of cross-country curriculum discussions, debates. We have heard already a number of them. And actually we do have in Europe, there's a European framework for reference of languages, and it is a sort of European curriculum framework. So it's an interesting one. And at the bottom of the list, but for some of us, the most important one is the individual curriculum. You might call the NAMA curriculum, the smallest unit. Personalized learning in this time of digital learning is a very popular term nowadays. So students that make their own choices and on their own learning routes, what to learn and how to learn and where to learn. And in this age of lifelong learning, so over long-term scale, you could say that the person, the individual themselves, can also be the designers of their own curriculum in some respects. Another way of looking at curriculum, are we talking about the intended curriculum? What are the beautiful ideas floating around? How is that formalized, written down? Are we talking about the implemented curriculum? How do teachers actually experience and perceive the intended curriculum, how do they interpret it, and what do they actually do in the classroom, the operational curriculum or the curriculum in action. And then, of course, if you come to the world of the students, how do they attain the curriculum, how do you actually experience the curriculum? Do you find it boring or motivating or interesting or whatever, or difficult? And what can we measure, if we try to measure it, what do we actually see that they have learned? And of course, there are always tensions between these three levels and oftentimes many discrepancies. And of course, the challenge is how can you bring more harmony in these different things? There will all be some tensions, otherwise there's no reason to initiate new curriculum changes. But to bring the sometimes spectacular gap a bit closer, that's of course the aim of curriculum development. Here's another favorite picture of the curriculum. And that says, if you agree a little bit to some extent about what you see as relevant, is it also consistent in the offering to the students? I've depicted here in a form symbolized in the spider web. Because if the classical question is about what is of most worth, and suppose you have some sort of agreement about that, there's a rationale underpinning many other questions for what actually the overall purpose that learning is for. The previous two speakers touched on a number of those issues. And if that results in some other objectives and content, so in what direction and what are they actually learning, we do realize those are very important discussions, but if you want to change that in practice, then many other questions about planning of learning should also be addressed sooner or later. Because of course, different aims usually have quite some consequences for how are the students learning and how does the role of the teachers change then? What sort of materials are used and resources that are they using? How are students grouped? Where do they learn? When are they learning? How much time is available? How can you allocate it between different domains? And last but not least, also curriculum assessment. How do we assess and measure what has been learned? Well, the short message of this spider web is that there are a number of questions that are relevant, and you need some consistency in addressing those. The spider web is to some extent flexible, but of course it's also vulnerable. If you keep pulling on opposite threads and there's no possibility to come together, there's no consistency, of course you'll have another failure. If we sometimes say in Dutch, every chain is as strong as its weakest element. And that's another easy explanation why it sometimes easily can go wrong. Of course, it all starts with your vision. Sooner or later, you cannot say, oh, let's change the objective without, well, what do you actually want? What do you think is important for learning? In the nowadays jargon, you might say, what competences, if you see that as the accumulation of knowledge and skills and attitude, are of most worth? Always a matter of balancing, of course. Do you want to put the emphasis especially on the qualification, so learning for further studies and work? Do you want to have the emphasis more on socialization or how to prepare the youngsters to participate in society, or is it more about to strengthen their personal development? That asks, of course, for a relevant discussion at every level, at the national level, at the school level, at the teacher level, and also people around the school that have a stake in those discussions often. Just a picture of a team of teachers of a vocational school for vocational educational levels where they use the spider web. They have a big map there on the floor where they try to deliberate what do we actually, where do we want to start, and where are we now, and what should be our priorities. It seems to help one way or another, this spider web, in facilitating, structuring the discussions, the very often very difficult discussions between teachers about what they actually want to do in the school. The future, they've talked about it. At least we have to find, each in our own context, a balance between the two perspectives. What we see in the Netherlands in the current debate ongoing, there has always been, yes, the knowledge development is still important, especially, I like the term, if you would emphasize more the powerful knowledge, not so much endless rows of facts, but the powerful knowledge. At the same time, there seems to be an agreement in the Netherlands and all stakeholders that it's also time that we need to pay attention more to personal and social development of the students. We need a new balance. At the same time, we have to be realistic, the feasibility. school time has only so many hours per week. So whereas the added value is also important, of course. Same time, we don't want too much fragmentation and overload in the curriculum. So it needs to be perhaps a bit small, at the same time coherent, goes vertically, in longitudinal lanes, and the coherence between subjects and domains needs also attention. At the same time, you cannot come to a full agreement for every school and every pupil. So in the Netherlands, we like to, okay, let's try at the same time, refrain ourselves from too much prescriptions and overload. Let's leave some space for diversity and for choice of schools and teachers and learners and parents. But obviously it varies across countries how important they find that. It's also sort of political choice, of course. How do you see the decision making between central and decentral decision making in curriculum matters? In the Netherlands, at least, we don't want a detailed prescribed sort of national curriculum, with all the accountability that we've seen in some countries have had a rather negative impact in the long run.
Dear Professor Acker, you have 3 minutes.
3 minutes, all right. Then I skip this. No, don't skip, that's it. 2 words now. Every time the most important question in curriculum discussions, the term relevance always comes back. Don't talk too quickly about effectiveness, how successful they are learning. No, first of all, it's of course, how relevant is it actually from the various perspectives? And is it consistently designed? And is it practical? And I go on with the practicality. Because, well, there he is again, Lawrence Stenhouse. I see John is looking happy now. There can be no curriculum change without teacher change. The other famous guy from Canada, Michael Fullen, said it also quite succinctly. Curriculum change is essentially about what teachers think and do. Let's take that seriously. So it does mean, indeed, you cannot have curriculum change without teacher development. They go hand in hand. And I always like to say, but there's also school development is important. How can that team of teachers together also be a sort of learning community? So teachers always key for student learning. The students will never notice any change in the curriculum unless the repertoire of the teacher is also changing. Here are a number of principles that relate to the teacher learning, but in view of the time, I will skip that. You can read a few terms here. But I always like to emphasize, we have sometimes these very simplistic ideas about top-down and bottom-up, bottom line, I think from experience, you know, pressure and support, those are the key ingredients for creating change, needs to come from various directions. Yes, sometimes we need a little bit of pressure and support from above, but definitely we also need some pressure and support from bottom up, but also from horizontal questions. Peers learn a lot from peers. So let the pressure and support come from different sides. A few recommendations for curriculum change. It does help, also if you're interested in sustainability and not short-term fashions, that if you have any coherent national framework, that it is at least clear, but not too broad, that there's a strong also local awareness and agency and expertise of the schools and teachers. You cannot command curriculum change from above. And it does help if those frameworks, your sort of broad consensus, is really discussed and justified from an overall vision on the what and why of learning, that people are aware, what are we actually talking about, where does it come from, why is this, not just a trick. No? And yes, we do like to think that it's good that there's choice and flexibility in the system. Very important for change that assessment, yes, assessment remains important, but it should follow the curriculum, not the way around, as we have seen too often. That we should pay more attention to the validity of the assessment. Reliability, yes, important, but let's not forget, are we actually measuring what we do find most important in view of the future? Then it's more flexible and it's more formative. A lot of workshops can be held about that. Very important, perhaps the most important one, that you need a lot of investments in curriculum professional development, both in pre-service and in-service, individuals and teams, school leaders and teachers, and all other education developments actually. Curriculum is not curriculum development, not producing more paper. It's essentially building on the capacity and repertoire of everybody involved. So, in conclusion, you might say we all in and around education need sort of critical thinking and conversation to create synergy of all our efforts. There is a challenge. In the Netherlands, we have a very dispersed political system and we like to disagree about anything in education. So everybody's looking a different direction. So you may wonder in such a situation, how do you do that? There is an alternative, of course, that looks like this. I would say that's a bit over the top. We would not like that. Everybody looking in the same direction would be very boring. So eventually you have to make up your own choice. What would you like to see happening for the curriculum change in and for Kazakhstan? Thank you.
Құрметті конференцияға қатысушылар, айтылған баяндамаларға және конференция тақырыбына қатысты бір ғана сұрақ қоюға болады. Қалған сұрақтарды сессияда жалғастырып қоюларыңызға болады. Сұрақтарыңыз болса? Dear guest, you can ask just one question, unfortunately. The rest of the time you can ask one question. Do you have any questions? Okay then. Құрметті қатысушылар, қазір үзіліс жарияланады, сағат 4:30-ға дейін. Сосын конференция, сессиялар, жаңағы аудиторияларда жалғастырылады.